Today's video is going to be a visual effects breakdown of the solar surfing animation that I made a few weeks ago. And I'm also going to be doing a demo of this cool little product over here called the TourBox Neo, which I'll get into more in a bit. I've got my GoPro just off camera here, you can kind of see it there. It's recording my hand, as you can see now, so you'll be able to see the buttons I'm pressing on the TourBox. And as we go through, I'll talk about how I've been using this for the last few weeks as part of my workflow for doing visual effects. So let's get into the video. I've chosen this shot to do the demo on because this is my favorite shot from the video and it has kind of everything in it except for the sail transition, which I'll show separately. But we've got the animation stuff going on here. It's a good demonstration of how the rig works, and there's also some cheeky particles from sparks coming off of here. We've got some cloth simulations and stuff going on in the background, so let's talk about that. First of all, the environment. I've made a couple of videos about this now, so you've probably kind of seen the general workflow. Basically, I made all of the stuff in this as assets that I then dragged into the scene and built this whole environment out of for every shot. So I actually have a master environment saved separately that I then link into all of the shots so that if I update anything, it changes in all of them. And I was really happy with how it turned out. I think all the cables and stuff hanging down is a really cool look. So the main workflow for the animation and the camera is I have two curves going through the whole scene like this. For the most part, I animated the entire scene in one large master file and then brought it into separate files and cut up the frame ranges. So for example, this starts at frame 205, it ends at 300. So I can basically take sections of the master animation and split them up into separate shots. So yeah, there's two curves in the scene. Obviously the camera and the character are following those curves. They're slightly different shapes just to make it a bit more interesting. This is done with a couple of constraints. So on the rig, I have a follow path constraint, which makes the rig follow the curve, and then the same for the camera. So the camera has a follow path constraint on it as well. And then to make it actually move, you select the path, go into the path settings and come down to path animation, and then under evaluation time, you can keyframe it. And then depending on where you keyframe it, it will change where the object is on the path at that point in time. The nice thing about doing it with curves is that I can change the shape of the curve or the path very easily without having to fiddle around with keyframes and stuff too much. So for example, if I wanted him to go a bit further back on this pipe, I can just move the curve back slightly, and it makes it very, very interactive in the way that you can animate it, which is nice. I've talked about the rig that I made before in a separate video, but I'll just demonstrate it again very quickly. Basically, the way I set it up is that the hands and feet are IK systems, so wherever the core moves, the hands and feet will still stay stuck to the board, which means that I had to do very little animation to actually make this all work. And then on top of that, the core actually has a noise modifier on it that will make the position of it go up and down randomly using a curve. So if I go to the graph editor and I look at some of the keyframes on these, you can see the keyframes for the X, Y, and Z locations all have noise modifiers on them. This makes the animation look a bit more organic because the character is constantly moving instead of just stuck in a really rigid position. And then I would just go in and add keyframes and stuff for like when he's bending his knees, just to do like a master position. And the rest of the kind of really fine micro detail in the animation was done procedurally. Just punch my microphone. The actual rig for the solar surfer is a separate rig. All the kind of rotations and stuff are controlled by this root bone. And then I also have a control for the sail rotation, which is here. And you can see again when I'm moving this, the arms actually move with it, which is really cool. Then at the back over here, I have two sliders for when the sail folds up. So this one makes all the stuff fold up, and then this one controls the scale so it all shrinks down into the bottom of the board. So that is pretty much how I did all of the shots. The process of the animating was basically just getting it on the curve and then blocking out the master positions and getting the timings right. And then once all the positions and stuff were blocked out, I would then go in and add keyframes onto the smaller things like the position of the board and the angle and the rotation and stuff to make it all look nice and realistic. It kind of felt like I was editing some sort of skateboarding montage when he was doing the grinds and stuff on this. It was quite fun. As I mentioned, I have the particle simulation going on here. It's all coming from a small emitter that's just parented to the board, and it's just emitting some particles that fire out. Keyframed it to start about here, and then they've got some velocity in the Y and Z axis just to make them shoot in the direction I wanted. So now on to something about the TourBox, which is down here. This thing's really cool. It's basically like a little macro keyboard. It's marketed as being for pretty much any artistic software, so you can use it for like Photoshop, 2D painting, 3D artwork, whatever. All of the buttons are completely customizable, so they don't come assigned with anything, and you use the software, which is down here, to basically assign any macro keys and stuff you want to all of the buttons. It's really, really simple to set up a new shortcut. You just go to whichever button it is, click on it, and then you can press a button, so for example Shift, and it will assign that control. The way I did it is I didn't immediately assign shortcuts. I just started using Blender with it, and then every time I wanted to have a feature that I could do in one button press, I assigned it to something on here. It's really tactile. All of the buttons are kind of different shapes and sizes, which makes it really fun. This one is really good for jogging through, so I've assigned this to the left and right arrow keys, and if I spin this dial, it can go backwards and forwards on the timeline. It feels a lot more organic than using the arrow keys to go back and forward or scrubbing through, because you can actually sort of spin the wheel, which is really fun. I've assigned this mouse wheel thing to zooming in and out. Usually I do this by holding control on the keyboard and then using my graphics tablet to zoom in and out, but it's nice to be able to do it without having to use both hands, which is quite cool. This scrolly thing also does the same thing. I mostly use this for zooming in and out on the timeline. Again, it feels a lot more precise than doing the control, click and drag thing, which I really like. And these two buttons are some of my favorite that I use the most in Blender. I've set these to switching between the compositor and the 3D view. And you can also do shader editor and stuff with these as well. So if I press this one once, it jumps to the compositor. And I think this is really important because I do lots of stuff with multiple render passes in Blender. So when I get to the stage where I want to be rendering stuff out, I'm constantly coming back to the compositor tab. And I can use these two buttons to switch between the 3D view and then the compositor really, really quickly. And actually what I end up usually doing is having two like this. So when I get to the stage where I want to do some compositing, I do this, press this button, and then I'm in the compositor. The shortcut for this is actually Shift F3, and that's the shortcut that takes you to the compositor. And if you keep pressing it, it will do things like the shader editor or the texture node editor. So if I press this a few times, I can go through all of them. So for example, I know that 4 presses takes me to the shader editor. I've then assigned this one on the top to be the UV editor or the image editor. This is great for quickly jumping in to change some UVs and stuff. I can go very quickly between the 3D viewport and the UV editor. I've assigned the button on the side to replace the Shift key, so I can use this for when I'm looking around in the viewport. And then the D-pad here I've assigned for jumping between keyframes. So if I select something that has keyframes on it, pressing up and down will jump between the keyframes. So it goes to the next one no matter how far it is, which is really handy. The whole thing is great. I really like how tactile it is compared to just using a normal keyboard because of all the different kind of shapes and sizes of the buttons and the different functions they have, like the scrolling. So that's pretty much all the Blender stuff. I'm going to jump into Nuke now and show the compositing for this video and also how I use the TourBox differently in Nuke. Okay, so this is the Nuke script. I had a very, very similar setup for all the shots. So I basically had a bit of a template that I brought in and worked in a very similar way because all the shots are pretty similar. So let's start at the top. The first thing I'm using is an HDRI for the clouds. So I'm using this to generate the sky essentially. The Blender render looks like this. So I have no sky in it and I'm doing all the skies and stuff in Nuke just because it's a bit easier to control them separately. I then take this and put it on a very big sphere in Nuke. So this basically works the same way as an environment texture in Blender. It just kind of wraps it around your entire scene. Then I bring in the camera from Blender. So this is the animated alembic. And I basically just film this massive sphere using the camera, and this generates a sky for me the same way it would in Blender. So it comes out looking like this, and then I do a bit of stuff like grading the saturation and the exposure to make it a bit more photorealistic. One mistake that lots of beginners make when they add skies and stuff into shots is they try and keep everything the correct exposure. In this, I deliberately made the sky quite overexposed because I wanted the camera to be exposing for the character and the environment, and if you did that in real life, the sky would be blown out. So I'm trying to keep this looking fairly realistic. And then after that, I'm adding a little 3D projection of a cliff in the background. As you can see in the Blender scenes, back here there's actually nothing, it just cuts off, so the environment just kind of disappears. I left that bit because in most of the shots you don't see it, but when I rendered it I realized in a couple of the renders you can actually see that gap. So instead of rendering the whole shot again, I basically made a little cliff to go back there. So I took this photo from textures.com, again did a little bit of color correction and stuff to it, cut it out so it looks like this, and then once I had that I put it on a card in 3D space here and I filmed it using the camera again, and that will just fill the gap that's left in the render, and once everything goes on top of it, it will bed in nicely. Then the next thing that goes on top is all of the CG, so that looks something like this. Because the film is essentially full CG, I didn't render lots of different passes, I just rendered everything into one main render, but I did use a cryptomat which allows me to separate out loads of stuff and grade it independently if I want to, which I did for most of the shots. In terms of the comp work on this, it starts out looking something like this. And then I'm just unpremulting it and doing a few different grades onto it, mostly just fiddling around with the brightness of some of the elements in the shot. Then after that, I add some light wrap and hazing onto this that's coming because the sky is very bright, so I wanted it to kind of interact with all of the stuff in the shot. So the first thing I do is make a kind of hazing effect. You can do this very easily by taking the background and then minusing the alpha of the render from it, so it looks something like this. And then if you add a few levels of blur onto it, you get this stuff where the background kind of bleeds over the edges of the alpha. And then you can put this back on top of the render, which looks something like this. And you can see that it's bleeding into the edges of the render, which looks really nice. All of the extra bit of the sky is going to disappear in a sec when we copy the alpha back in and then pre-mult it. So you can see this is before the hazing and this is after, and it will be more apparent what that's doing in a sec when I put it on top. I've also got a couple of levels of light wrap. There's a quite harsh one and then a much softer one like this, and then I put this back on top of the background of the sky. And so just to show you what the hazing and stuff looks like on the actual render, this is before and after haze. You can see it adds a kind of like nice glow effect when the stuff in the background is really bright. It makes it feel a little bit more like it was shot through a real camera, and you get the kind of artifacts of what happens when you fire bright lights into a lens. So that's before any hazing or light wrap, and that's after. As you can see, it makes it look a lot nicer. Then after that, I put some glow on the sails using the emission pass. So I separate out the emission. I've got the sparks and stuff in here as well. I use a cryptomat just to isolate the different things that I want to have the glow on. So for example, here, I just isolate the sail. I put a bit of a grade on it to make it a bit brighter. Then I put a glow on top of that, and this goes on top of the sail. And I guess this just makes it feel more like it's kind of that futuristic solar surfing energy vibe. So that looks something like this. It's quite subtle, but that's the before and after. Just kind of enhances the sail a bit. Then on top of that, we have the sparks. So I'm also adding some glows onto the sparks. They start off with the emission, and then I use the crypto matte to just isolate the sparks as well. That looks like this. Glow on the sparks, plus that on top. Again, it's quite subtle. That's before and after, so I'm just glowing the sparks. Then I do some lens distortion stuff. So all renders come out of CG software undistorted. What I want to do is add some lens distortion back in so you get the edges curving and stuff like a real camera. So that's what that looks like. It's pretty subtle, but it just helps it to make it feel a bit more organic as opposed to the straight out of a render kind of vibe. Then I add a lens flare on top of that, which looks something like this. I put the lens flare up where the sun should be, and then you kind of have this streaky flare coming across the character, which looks quite cool. Then one of the last things I put on top is some lens dirt. So you can see here when the very bright sparks are going towards the camera, they're actually kind of lighting up what is simulating some dirt on the lens, which gives you this cool effect. Again, this is just one of those artifacts that you get when you film through a real camera, and this always helps to make CG feel a little bit less CG. You can get this effect by taking some sort of lens dirt overlay or image. I did a bit of grading to it so it looks like this, and then transformed it around a little bit, and then I took the render of the sparks, graded it and blurred it quite a bit so it looks like this, and then you can multiply that over the top of the image. And what that does is Nuke says whatever's bright here, make that like a mask almost for where the lens dirt should be. So it makes it that color, and it also makes it only the area that the sparks are lighting up. So that's before, and that's with it multiplied on top. And then this gets screened on top of the render quite subtly, so it looks like that. Really, really cool. And then finally down here, I'm just adding a really tiny bit of chromatic aberration onto the edges of the frame. It's pretty subtle. You can hardly even see it there. You can probably just see the shift of the pixels ever so slightly. And chromatic aberration is another one of the kind of artifacts that you get when you film through a lens. Towards the edges of the frame especially, you get that kind of separating of the color channels, which looks really cool. It's really easy to over egg this, so I've tried to do it really subtly, and I've also only done it at the edges of the frame. So I used a radial in Nuke to make this mask and then inverted it. And so in the center of the frame, it doesn't do any, and then as it gets closer to the edges, it adds more and more chromatic aberration. And that is the final shot. So now, very briefly, how do I use the TourBox in Nuke? The thing I really like about the TourBox is you can use different presets for different pieces of software. So if I open the menu for it, I've got auto switch turned on, which basically means when you open different pieces of software, it will automatically change what the buttons do depending on what you assign them to. I've got a preset for Google Chrome. I use an online photo editor to do all of my thumbnails, which is similar to Photoshop, but it's free. So I've got a load of presets set up for that. Then I have one for Blender, which is the one that I was showing earlier. I have one for DaVinci Resolve, which is really cool. It's very, very similar to my Blender setup. I can use this dial to basically scrub backwards and forwards in the timeline, which I really like. In Nuke, it's a little bit different. Originally, I wasn't sure how useful I was going to find this in Nuke because it's quite shortcut specific, and I usually just have my hand on the keyboard. But the more I thought about it, the more I found that for doing roto or paint work, it's actually a really, really cool tool. So if I turn off my zoom in on the camera quickly on my webcam, I'll show you what I mean. Let me point the camera down slightly. So this is a bit of a strange angle, but basically when you're doing painting in Nuke, you're going through frame by frame and doing lots of detailed work. So my hand is on the arrow keys over here, and I'm using the Wacom tablet here. And so my arms are kind of crossing over each other and get in the way. And especially when I'm at work and I'm doing quite a detailed shot, you can spend quite a lot of time doing painting. So you can be doing this for quite a long time, and it's a bit of a strange position. So after a couple of days of using it, I actually found I can remap all of the controls onto here and do all of the flicking backwards and forwards in the frames with this hand, and then have this arm completely unrestricted for when I'm doing the stuff with the Wacom tablet. I didn't actually do any paint work in this shot, but I'll give an example of how it works. So on the ToolBox, like the other ones, I've assigned the wheel to go through and actually change what frame number I'm on. So this is essentially mimicking the left and right arrow keys. Same with the left and right on the D-pad. These are backwards and forwards as well. These are a bit more precise than the dial if you just want to go one frame. The up and down arrow keys like Blender jump between the keyframes, which is quite nice. So these are assigned to Alt left and Alt right. Then if I'm doing some painting, I've assigned this button here to be the keyboard shortcut C, which will open either the reveal tool or the clone tool. And if I press it again, I can switch between the tools, as you can see here. And then these two buttons here next to my thumb control the size of the brush like this. So this button here is basically shift, and when I use the Wacom cursor, it will then change the size of the brush. And then this one here is essentially control, and this changes where you're cloning from and where you're painting it to. I don't know if you can see, there's a button here next to the scroll wheel. I've assigned this to be the keyboard shortcut H, which resets your viewer to fill the screen. This one's really handy, and I press that loads as well. And again, I've assigned the button on the side to be Control Z, so I can undo the paint strokes with one button, which is really easy. I find that it's really easy when my hands aren't crossing over each other, and I can have one hand completely off the keyboard off to the side and one hand doing the stuff with the Wacom tablet. It's a much more comfortable position when you're doing lots of paint work. So the ToolBox now lives on my desk full time. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to jump into one of the sail transition shots because they're quite cool. So this is shot 12, and this is one of the shots where the sail transitions and opens up. You can probably see the Nuke script looks kind of similar. So if I look at the Blender scene, it starts off where at the beginning of the shot, the sail is actually fully closed, and as the shot begins, these sliders animate to open and close, which makes the sail pop out. So if I go forward a bit, the sail pops out, and then you see a few frames later, these rods and stuff kind of fold down back into place. And even though you can see the geometry of the sails here, they're actually not always there in the render, because I use a transparent shader on them mixed with a noise texture that makes them appear. So if I go into the shader editor, I've got a setup on them that looks like this. Basically, it's a noise texture that's animated with a color ramp to go from really extreme crunchy black, so fully black, and then over the course of about 10 frames, the color ramp animates to become white. And then this goes into a mix shader that's mixing between the actual shader of the sail and a transparent shader, and using this as the factor essentially. So it's saying when it's fully black, this should be transparent. And then here, what's black is the transparency, what's white is the sail shader. And then at this point, it transitions into basically being the full shader of the sails, and then it flies off. But as you can probably see here, this effect isn't very interesting. And in the film, they have this really cool like flash of light as the sail opens that makes it look really awesome. And I really wanted to mimic that effect. So the way I did it was I actually rendered that mask that I was showing in Blender. So I have this black and white mask that's then dissolving the sail on. And then what I did is I used an edge detect node on this to basically find the edges of the texture, which gives me this. Then I took the actual alpha of the sails and eroded it down slightly and blurred it. And then I used that as a mask just to take away the edges, because as you can probably see here, it was also detecting the edge of the sails, which I didn't really want. I just wanted the inside of it. So I used the slightly eroded alpha to basically cut off the edges. And then once I had that, I added a glow onto this and then graded it to be that kind of orangey color of the sails, and then put this on top. And this does a great job of making the sail opening feel more powerful, and it makes you notice it more because it's a really bright flash as opposed to it just dissolving on. So this is before and this is after. Makes a massive difference obviously. And this is what it looks like on the run, so you can see. It's a really quick effect. It happens so quickly that you don't really notice it unless you're looking for it. But I really love these frames where you can see it in the middle where it's transitioning between them. So that's how all the 3D was done, and also how I composited it. Hopefully this was a cool insight into the workflow. As I said with the text at the end of the last video, this took absolutely ages to do. I spent about 2 months on and off in my evenings after work and stuff, building all the assets, especially the environment. And then doing all the animations and stuff took a couple of weeks. So yeah, that was a lot of effort for a 56-second video, whatever it was. Lots of people said they were interested in seeing how it was done, so hopefully this was a cool look behind the curtain at the process. And also a little look at the Toolbox Neo. I've always wanted something like this, but they've always been about $500 or $600, the ones that I've looked at, so I've always shied away from it just because I didn't think they were worth that much money. The Toolbox is a lot more affordable, which makes it a lot more accessible to people like me that are interested but didn't want to spend the extra money to get one of the really expensive ones. It's really well made, it's got a really nice weight to it, so it feels nice and heavy. All the buttons feel really high quality, they're like really satisfying to press, and everything's really tactile about it, which I absolutely love. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to their website in the description, and they've also kindly given me a code for you guys so you can get yourself a bit of a discount if you're interested in picking one up. Final self-plug before the video ends: if you want any of the Treasure Planet project files, I'm putting them all on Patreon. There's already a few on there, and I'm going to be uploading the rest of the shots over the course of the next few weeks, and I'm also working on making the Nuke scripts available for anyone that's interested. Thank you for watching the video, hopefully you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.